Grab a seat, order your drink, and welcome to the brightest center in the galaxy for all things Star Wars Expanded Universe, and whatever else might blow in the door. You're listening to the Callum's Cantina podcast, and I'm your host, Callum. No matter if you're a seasoned bounty hunter of lore or just looking for a good story, you've stumbled into the right cantina. Today, we're laying out a foundation for the podcast going forwards, and for all people that may not be familiar with the Star Wars Expanded Universe, in an introduction to the Star Wars Expanded Universe. We're talking about what it actually is, what draws us to it, and some things people approaching this part of the franchise should know. So pull up a chair and let's unravel the legends.
I am Ethan, commonly known on YouTube and other places as Jack's Voss.
And I get called many things. Jeff is probably the most appropriate one there.
Yeah.
And at the moment making up 33.3% of this podcast. So this podcast is about 66% Australian. We're doing very well today.
Yeah, let's go.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm happy to be the only American.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess I'd start with, I've got my own how I've explained what the EU is, but how would you guys explain it?
I think with any movie, you always kind of want to know what happened at the beginning and the end. So one that I watched recently actually was, again, Leon the Professional, which probably divides a lot of people. But when you finish watching that particular film, you think to yourself, but what happens after? What kind of a life does Matilda lead from here? Or what kind of a career did Leon have up to that point? So you ask these questions about before, during, and after, because you want to know more if you really enjoy something. And that's largely what the EU was. You watch these movies, and most of us started with the movies. Not everyone, which is interesting, but we mostly start with the movies. And then if you really enjoy them, you get to the end of Return of the Jedi and you think, well, what next? What happens to these characters now that the Empire appears to be defeated and so on? But you ask these questions again for previously, like what was Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan like before Episode 1? What happened between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi? So filling in all these questions that if you really enjoyed the movie, it just fills in all those gaps and extrapolates upon what you've already watched, which can be, in this case, really fulfilling. Not a lot of franchises do it, so ones that I like, Firefly did it. Firefly's continued with comics and novels and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but obviously, Star Trek goes on for miles with its comics and novels and so on as well. And but that's essentially just what it is. It's just expanding upon everything that you saw in the films. The films keep alluding to other things, other battles, other friendships, like. One of them that comes to the top of my head would be Han and Lando when they first meet, and it's very clear that there's this entire backstory of other things that have happened to them in their careers and that sort of stuff that obviously the movie simply can't tackle. So, yeah, it's just a way of watching these films and then enjoying the expanded stories of those characters that you came to love. For me, anyway.
Yeah, cool.
Well, for the most part, I tend to agree with Jeff here. It's more about knowing about the characters. That's what really gets you into it. As far as at least that's how it was for me. I wanted to know like what happened to Han, Luke, Leia, and Chewie after Revenge of the Sith or Return of the Jedi. Sorry, and then I wanted to know. What was happening to Obi-Wan and what was happening with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon before the Phantom Menace. And then I was also curious about like what was happening during the Clone Wars.
Yep.
And of course, like I had just entered the EU when that started, when that was going on, so I was able to I was reading the comics, well, some of them, just before Revenge of the Sith came out. And so I was very confused. I remember the first time I opened Obsession because I wasn't able to get the comics in order. So I opened up Obsession. I'm like, why does Anakin have long hair?
Yeah.
That was the first thing out of my mouth. What did they do to Anakin and Obi-Wan? Obi-Wan's hair is short. Anakin's hair is long. what is going on here?
Yep.
I knew Anakin was a knight. I knew that. But I
Yeah.
was confused why his hair was long.
Yeah.
Mm.
Which that, in some ways too, you actually did just quickly touch on another thing that the EU does for us as well, is I have seen before people say, well, there's a meme about Star Wars, the first movie, A New Hope, as it came to be known. There's a bit of a strong meme there where people was like, it was a rather bold filmmaking decision, not knowing that there was going to be any more movies, for George Lucas to produce this lightsaber to Luke and then have him never use it. A rather bold decision, but in the same way, the prequels had a rather bold decision of, at the end of Attack of the Clones, at the end of Episode 2, the Clone War just begins, and everyone's like, oh, this Clone War that we've heard all about, what's going on? And then there's almost this rug pull that you get to the third film, Episode 3, and it's basically the end of the Clone Wars. You're like, wait a second. We've been waiting for this since 1977. Where did the Clone Wars go? Like, there's actually no film that centers on the Clone. Well, I mean, obviously the animated later on, but we won't talk about that fiasco. But
Might need
again,
to
it's one of
touch
those-
on it, but yeah.
Well,
we
we,
may.
do have the micro series, which
Yeah.
a lot of people, adults and kids alike, watched that when it was
God, yeah.
out.
But no, even within the movie, there's all these. I mean, I guess the other funny thing about the EU is it starts to actually be self-prophesizing and building on itself, where it began as a way for us to follow Luke and Leia and Han and Chewie and everything else like that. But then you have, Han and Leia's kids and Luke's kids, and then you go on from there. And so suddenly you've got parts of the EU that have very little to do with the films, mostly because the characters are either dead or not born yet, because you've gone so far backwards or forwards. But it's just that the EU is now explaining parts of the EU, which is explaining parts of the EU, so it ends up just being this this constant. But I was going to say, by the same token, in the films, we also do have that constant thing of they'll, like Palpatine, when he says, "Have you heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?" Again, if you're just watching the films, this is clearly a very important piece of lore that gets smooshed into like 40 seconds of monologue, and that's it. It's done. And so, again, the EU's way to expand on those ideas that are touched on in the films, but you barely get to actually see. So,
yeah. Great examples of that is like some of the Tales of and From books where they take the characters from the Cantina, expand on their stories, get the bounty hunters expand on their stories. It's really cool.
Yep.
Oh, it really is.
And what stands
there
out
is
to
that-
me along with it is how it's a single timeline through a lot of it, and not like you mentioned Star Trek. That tends to at least have the approach of, oh, that's going to be separate from the TV show
Yeah.
for the most.
Which was one of the biggest draw cards to me of the EU was that. Because even a lot of the comics that I grew up reading, and I grew up loving DC Comics and Marvel Comics and that sort of thing as well, but I always found it quite difficult to get involved with those characters or interested in those characters, because it was different universes. If someone died, it didn't necessarily mean much, because they'd be back next week. If someone turned evil, it didn't mean much, because there would be a different universe. In the EU, when Chewie dies, well, Chewie's dead. And that has an impact. It has a rolling impact on the characters the next few books, and so it doesn't. It doesn't really lose any of its importance. Where the importance is somewhat lost if you're and the EU does have infinities, I know, but for the most part, it was just one beginning to end timeline, and that really gave it an awful lot of and weight.
The exception to that is infinities, which has been what if stories that has usually just been one-off comics or
usually,
and were also very clearly marked as such. Like for some of the Star Trek novels, just to use an obvious example, some of the Star Trek novels, if you just read them in a vacuum, it's not obvious that they're supposed to be a separate universe or not be taken seriously, because they're quite good, and the story's quite good, and the characters behave like the characters should. It's just that it's not a part of the main universe, wherever they want to put that. And again, that's why Star Wars meant a lot to me, is because the parodies, if you will, the ones that are infinities, they're very clearly infinities. Like I've said before, it's a bit of a silly example, but Ewoks running around with undies on their heads or whatever. It's just it's just being silly. It's just having a bit of fun, and it's obvious fun. No one in their right mind is going to read some of these comics and think, "Oh, that's weird. Why would that have happened?" Particularly the ones that are actual infinities comics of the movies themselves.
Yeah,
Clearly,
they
that's
pick one event to go a bit differently and go, what would have happened a bit in the time frame of the movie if that went differently,
Right.
which is cool.
And then the next second, you got Darth Vader in his white armor, which is a fantastic figure to own.
Yeah.
So how I've defined the expanded universe on my website, I might as well get to pull it back to mine since I asked you guys.
Some shameless self-plugging, no worries.
Self-plugging, callumscantina.com, where I still have been slack with putting up short stories and even putting up about this podcast, but we'll get there. So yeah, how I've defined it is it's a timeline that includes every single piece of officially licensed material before the 25th of April 2014. Outside of the main original saga movies, which is, as you say, the prequels and the original trilogy. I would hope people are familiar enough with those who are watching. Before the
Can't assume,
sidelining
I
of the
guess.
expanded universe in favor of a new timeline. So, yes, this might involve some discussion.
If the three of us are the first thing that someone is experiencing about the Star Wars universe, they're in trouble. So I'm
You're
assuming
probably not wrong.
I'm assuming at some point they've got some vague understanding of the movies and how the timeline works. Because
I mean, I
don't
hope
think,
so. I hope
yeah,
so.
I don't think in 3 years' time we're going to have some podcasters talking about Star Wars. Like, what was your introduction? Well, I found these three weirdos on YouTube, and I thought, oh, that sounds like. I don't think we're the landing point.
I hope not.
No.
Wait for it. Let's see.
So somehow, if we somehow convince some kid down the line to just watch Star Wars for the first time, we're gonna be like, "What?"
Yeah, it's like, how'd that happen?
Oh man.
And
Anyway,
great points that you've made. There are a couple of exceptions to the whole date thing, because there was an announcement on Sales.com for people that know when they made the new movies, they started a new timeline. And then they didn't really have a transition period. So some stuff kind of carries over. Like
that is true.
With publication dates and things. Son of Dathomir was based on a script from the 2008 Clone Wars show, which goes into, if you would consider the Clone Wars 2008 as part of your headcanon, then you would include Son of Dathomir. That's probably a topic we should touch on. And the old
That's another topic for another time.
Has some short stories and updates that also fall in the expanded universe timeline because it's an ongoing MMO. Although I would say, as the expansions have gone on, it's gone a little bit more sus.
Yeah,
it's really become its own universe at this point.
Yeah,
like there are parts that are
actually
just contradictory at a certain point.
I was going to say, it actually does occur to me that there are so many exceptions to the rule. There's so many caveats to that. Where obviously you can say the expanded universe is all the official license that came out until 2014, and that's a pretty good blanket rule.
Yeah,
but then obviously old Marvel comics, which we tend to treat slightly differently. But then there was a lot of attempts to bring them into the actual EU later, which I think were mostly quite successful. There's obviously the Clone Wars, which we will touch on at some point, plus its little movie spin-off, and then some of the comics that ate into that. And then even some of the games like Knights of the Old Republic, where you've got a light side or a dark side ending, even though that is actually a canonical story, there is only really one telling of it, if that makes any sense. So there's a lot of caveats going on there.
One ending that carries an impact through the timeline, essentially.
Yeah.
So I guess to segue off of you mentioning the classic Marvel comics, for people that don't know, Marvel originally had the Rise to Star Wars comics, and they did a whole 107 issue run plus droids and Ewoks, and a couple of the movie adaptations were outside of the numbered runs.
Which I always found so weird. Just to quickly say, like, why did Return of the Jedi somehow fall outside of the comic count? But anyway,
I don't know.
They just did it for some bizarre reason.
Because they could.
When we're approaching some of the older material, especially like that, because that was 1977 till I'd have to check the date exactly. Until
Well, there was
1991.
also 3 separate publications as well, because you had the actual Marvel runs, like as in the numbered Marvel runs that you mentioned.
Mhm.
But then there was also the newspaper clips where they had like the separate stories that were just running
Oh, yeah.
serialized in the newspapers.
Yeah,
And
I
then there's
forgot about
also the
those.
Marvel illustrated books, which I don't see many people owning. I've got them behind me there somewhere.
Mm.
And they had totally different stories as well that they were really nicely presented, but again, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
say they don't fit the EU, but they only fit the EU because of certain authors that later on went back to these original
Yeah.
comics and said, "How can we make this fit the EU?" And some of them did a really good job, which I will touch on later.
Yeah.
But some of them did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
There's
And
also
stuff.
then of course there's the original novel. Why
Yeah.
am I blanking on the name?
Star
I've
Wars from the Adventures of Luke Skywalker.
Right, that's the one. No,
And
what is it called?
so, while you're thinking a little bit, I will go. Technically, since the expanded universe's novels and comics and that, the original Star Wars novelization in 1976 would have actually kicked it off. But there are a couple of other points that people consider to be the actual creation of the EU. So you have in 1978 with Splinter of the Mind's Eye. That might be the one.
Splinter
you're
of the Mind's
thinking
Eye.
of.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
talking about.
That is the first novel published that was not
Yeah.
the story adapted from a film.
Yeah.
Or a script of the film, since the novel came out earlier because they wrote it based on the script, and that's where some discrepancies are.
The idea behind Splinter of the Mind's Eye was that at the time, George didn't think he was going to get to do another movie, so he allowed the guy who
Alan
wrote
Dean
it,
Foster.
Alan Dean Foster, to write a book based on the characters that were in the movie, and
which would have been Alan Dean Foster's second Star Wars novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's not officially credited.
No,
he ghost wrote
definitely not.
the novel.
He's the ghostwriter
Yep.
of Star Wars the novel.
Yeah, Splinter's interesting because that's where you get, and when you read it, you can see recurring ideas come through, as well as
that's the writer.
it was written so Harrison Ford had only signed on for one movie. If they couldn't get him to sign again, that's why Han Solo isn't in Splinter of the Mind's Eye, that kind of thing. And they wrote scenes that would be cheap to film because George wouldn't have had as big a budget.
Yeah. And again, I haven't read that one. I haven't even read the comic. I need to. I've got like
I really enjoyed
5 sets of comics that I need to read yet. And Union being one of those.
Nice.
But my understanding of Splinter of the Mind's Eye is it did allow for a number of things to come in to, like, it's considered like the beginning of the EU, and it allowed for force powers that we don't really see anywhere else. It really allowed for the force to really expand beyond what little you see of it in A New Hope. Even some of the stuff that we're given in the next 2 movies, there isn't a lot force-wise. Like, we get force visions, we get telekinetic powers and force lightning. That's really about all we see.
Yeah.
So it's just, where is the, like, there isn't a whole lot in there. You get a lot more of it in the animated stuff and in the prequels, because CGI is a thing by the time of the prequels, and it allows for certain abilities that weren't demonstrable, at least not without making it look incredibly cheesy.
Yeah.
No. but as time went on, so there is an advantage to stuff like that. Is that in a book you can describe things, and in the later comic you can illustrate them.
Yeah.
So there are some nice things for those.
Yeah, and the
So-
other starting point that you could argue as the start of the expanded universe proper was 1991 when Enter the Empire came out, and then also
Yeah.
Dark Horse started the comics, which,
Yes.
I
for
think
context
for-
as
I
well,
think for a
there
lot of fans-
Marvel lost the rights to the Star Wars comics and it went to Dark Horse Comics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think for a lot of fans, that is actually where it did start.
Mhm.
It is.
Which is probably mostly from a continuity standpoint, because if there was any continuity
Yeah.
before with the Marvel comics and such, it was almost a mistake, if that makes sense. Like, I don't feel like there was an awful lot of, from what I gather, listening to interviews now, wasn't a lot of back and forth between the different authors saying, hey, I'm going to write this, so can you write that, and continue these stories, continue these characters and arcs.
Mhm.
Whereas the authors really started working together from 1991 onwards, where they'd all be talking back and forth and making sure that their work didn't contradict something else has been written at the time or something that had been written previously or future plans. So that's
Mhm.
probably where it did start for a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
And one thing that I did note about the 1991 period, moving forward from there, is
Mhm.
that they really tried very hard to be as consistent as possible across multiple authors, and they even tried to coordinate with George as much as possible.
Yeah.
And so, and the contradictions that develop when the prequels come out is because George changed his mind.
Yeah, that's it.
Like it's all because George decided to change his initial plans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a good point as well. Like when you're reading Expanded Universe, especially looking at release date and older stuff like classic Marvel and that, you have to keep in mind when it was released and what it was in the
Yeah.
publication schedule. Because I think that's one of the most important things for clearing up a lot of any of the, oh, that contradicts that. It's like, well, it was released before that. So, of course, the dates for the Clone Wars will be wrong because George changed his mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing. Theoretically, Anakin and Obi-Wan were originally like 10 years older than they are. Like that's the thing. They were originally supposed to be about 10 years older than their characters actually end up being. So that's why Obi-Wan, that's why Alec Guinness is playing 50-year-old Obi-Wan
Yeah.
in his late 60s. You know, and you
But
know,
as
so to
has been
explain
pointed out,
they explain that people who live on Tatooine age prematurely. They age faster, which that works.
And so those
Anyway.
are the three main points that I'd say
Mhm.
Pete could consider as the starting points of the expanded universe.
Yes.
I think they also from 1991 started marketing it as expanded universe as well.
Yeah, that is when they started marketing it as the expanded universe, which is why a lot of people view Heir to the Empire as the beginning.
Yeah.
It's definitely the beginning of the expanded universe in name and in concept, but I consider Splinter of the Mind's Eye the beginning of what would become the expanded universe.
Yeah, and I kind of consider that the Marvel comics could be a good starting point as well because they started telling stories that were outside of just a movie adaptation as well.
Right. Well,
and then as the years would,
they started also like branching out and making characters, like obviously the different writers of the comics, they focused on the characters that they created. So like you have these through lines that seem very disjointed because this guy's doing issue 10 and this guy's doing issue 11 and this guy's doing issue 12 and now the first guy's doing issue 13, so you got So you've got through lines through random through randomly placed comics, but you have but you also have the numerical order, and in theory, each issue is supposed to be its own short story.
Yeah.
But
well, they had to be.
Yeah,
That's yeah.
They only
But
near
they
the end
have
started doing
overlap.
multi-issue stories a bit more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was kind of towards the end, I think, more because it was becoming more popular, and also like by the time Return of the Jedi came out, Star Wars had more of a clear through line to it. So you had those comics were able to be a little bit more expansive in themselves.
Yeah, because
Well, they were also
they couldn't
really
do too
restricted.
much
That was
with
the other
some
thing.
things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were super restricted because if you were a Marvel writer before Empire Strikes Back came out, you can't progress the story very far because you don't want to bump into, you don't want to change the law. You know, you don't want to start writing, oh, you know, Luke Skywalker has died and Chewbacca finds out he's a Jedi or whatever. And then you get to the next movie and go, oh, that's not correct. Oh, sorry.
I want that
And then
Infinities comic now.
and then the
Luke
same.
Skywalker dies and Chewbacca's a Jedi. Awesome.
And then they had the same problem afterwards because obviously Empire Strikes Back has done its thing, and so now they've got to write all of these comics with the idea that Han is out of the picture. Is he ever going to come back? We don't know, and they're trying not to bump into the next film. So again, they're quite restricted, and so they have to write things serialized where this story happens, and they're back in space waiting for it, and then this thing happens, and they're back. They have to come back to the same point because they're kind of frozen until the next movie comes out.
Yeah, and a good example of that is how much Luke and Leia kiss in the Marvel comics.
Yeah.
And then it's revealed, wait, she's my sister.
That's one of those things where it's like, oh, that's gross.
It was like 1,000 Marvel writers suddenly screamed out. And
No!
Yeah. Well, it's really funny because like everything that takes place after Return of the Jedi, they kind of pretend that never happened.
Yeah.
But like they have to ignore. But anyone who's writing in a in the storyline that takes place before Return of the Jedi, they have to acknowledge it. So it's like man, we have to acknowledge this because we're writing in this time period. So that's why there aren't a lot of books that take place between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. And like aside from
focusing on other characters,
Shadows of the Empire, there really isn't much else between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So yeah, those are why. So I think now we could move on to like good starting points for people to hop into.
Yeah.
And personally, like I do consider my favorite starting point when people ask like what's a good Star Wars book to start with, I'm like Heir to the Empire. The entire Thrawn trilogy is where I think you should start if you like books.
Yeah, novels for sure.
But at the same time, if you want to be more associated directly with the movies, Shadows of the Empire. You know, and of course this is all original trilogy based.
Yeah,
you know,
and
those are my starting points.
And it's incredibly subjective because every time this question's ever come up, you almost get as many replies as you do people in the room. It's like if aliens landed and they said, "Oh, you guys got food. What should I eat first?" You'd just get so many different people saying their favorite food.
Yeah,
and you'd never really get a great consensus on what they should eat first, unless of course they've got some alien dietary ailments that it would kill them if they ate something.
I don't know. I think pizza would be pretty popular universally.
It'd be up there. It'd be in the top 10 for sure. It'd be
absolutely.
And then the alien would say, "Do I do pineapple or no pineapple?" And then watch the riot start. But
Well,
it's
then you
And then they
direct
put
them
apples
go to
on them.
Italy and get it there.
yeah.
My approach
Yeah,
to this, and I have an old video. Oh my goodness, that's 6 years ago now. Of where to start
That's
with
how
the
time works.
novels.
Yeah.
And I think it examples this sort of thing too, because I went through and it's kind of a case by case basis of who you're talking to and what you're
Mm.
interested in, specifically what aspect of
Yeah.
Star Wars that you like. So, like, Heir to the
Or
Empire is a great general
even
starting point for sure.
yeah. But even also what media you're into and even your
Yeah.
age. I mean, there's a lot of different variations because quite famously, like I've said this to you guys before, and there was a lot of eye rolling. My first introduction was still the Jedi Prince series. But
Yeah,
that's just because of how young I
that's
was.
good fun.
You know, growing up, my parents had copies of Heir to the Empire and a few other books lying around the house when I was, a child. But I wasn't about to read them when I was like 4 years old.
Mm.
But I could, at 4, 5, 6, 7, I could start to tackle some of these younger reader books. So, while that might be a rather extreme example for some other people, you might say, "Oh, you want to get your child into the EU."
Mm.
Well, we're not going to be suggesting Heir to the Empire right now, but hey, here's the Ewoks animated cartoons. So
Yeah.
there is that to consider, I guess, for a lot of people.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
if you know
and
someone
there's
who
a
prefers
bunch
comics,
of I think more people around my age than that now, especially Nathan and I's age, that I know you're 12,
rude. Yeah,
that have gotten into the EU through video games more,
yeah,
Oh yeah,
that's it.
and
one
that
Mhm.
of the
has been
most
a great
popular
starting
ones
point.
is, of course, the Force Unleashed.
Yeah,
Uh,
Yeah,
Probably the
and
biggest expanded universe video game to ever come out. Uh,
mm,
Like,
yeah.
there are a couple that
I'm
are up
actually
there. You could probably debate something like KOTOR because so many people
you
have played that as
you
well.
could debate Knights of the Old Republic. Um,
or
Shadows of
Battlecry.
the Empire was also pretty popular when it came
Yeah.
out.
I
Though I
do
think the
wonder.
novel and comic were more popular than the video game in that
Yeah, and
case.
I think in this time period, the age does show its game. The game does show its
Mm.
age a bit.
Yeah,
Knowing
it
when I played
does
it.
a little bit more. So but like I I had vague knowledge of Knights of the Old Republic um,
Mhm.
when the Force Unleashed came out, and I remember the Force Unleashed coming out, and I had never seen so many people so excited for a video game.
Mm,
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
yeah.
I was shocked because of how popular it was. I was like, really?
Mm.
Like I had people who didn't really care for the movies who wanted to play this video game. I
Oh,
was
there you
like,
go. Mm.
what?
yeah,
So I guess
yeah.
it
Well,
goes
I mean, I
to
was
be a
just going to
little
say with
bit
that
similar
two
to us
things.
thinking about essentials, but in a different point of view of what
Mhm.
you're interested in. Because I've sort of
Yeah.
broken
Yeah.
it down into like, if you really love the Jedi and the prequel era, you could read something like Jedi Apprentice, and even as an adult,
Oh
and
yeah.
the younger audience
Mm.
book,
I
they're
I
great.
still love Jedi Apprentice. I still love it.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh yeah.
An alternative post Return of the Jedi start is like the day after is the Chief of Bakura. That's also a great.
Hmm.
That'd be a good start point.
Or
I actually need
or
to
the
read that one.
or the Marvel comic, The Day After the Death Star. There is that.
Mm.
That's
And
obviously set just slightly earlier on the same day.
Yeah.
yeah, if you want to,
Comics I find a little bit
explore-
harder to direct people on.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
If you want to explore stuff that just expands a bit on the movies while getting a sense of what the EU does, then you get stuff like Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, Tales from
Yeah.
Jabba's Palace, and Tales of the Bounty Hunters, that are collections of
Mhm.
short stories that really
Yeah.
just expand and add so much more depth to the movies, which is
Yeah. You
great,
do
and
get a bit
what we
more
talked about.
with that stuff. And then if you're looking more for prequel stuff, I mean, there is obviously Jedi Apprentice, there's Darth Plagueis,
Mhm.
if you're wanting to get into stuff a bit more. But at the same time, Darth Plagueis is going to really point out that there's so much more.
Yes.
I was about to
Like,
say that Darth Plagueis to me almost feels like a late stage read, just because it leans on so much other work. I mean, like we said in the previous video, or maybe previous 2 videos ago, we've said it
Mhm.
recently,
we
where
did.
Darth Plagueis is such a fantastic novel, but you don't realize just what a work of art it is until you've read all the other stories
Mm.
around it
Yeah,
and see how
there's
well it
there's
fits them
whole
all together.
stories I haven't gotten to that are still referenced.
Or
Yeah.
even reading it and, I read that too long ago. I don't remember that reference.
Oh, you could have that issue, yeah.
So if you're starting with Darth Plagueis, it does a great lead into Phantom Menace.
It
However,
does.
you would also be aware that there's stuff you're not gonna get, and there could be the approach of, "Oh, this is a reference to that. I'm gonna have a look at where that's from," and then you could
Yeah,
expand out
yeah.
your reading from there if that's an approach that you like. But it can get
Mhm.
a bit much for some people, I have seen.
Right. Because Darth Plagueis
You
is very like there's so much there's you've got Cloak of Deception,
Yeah.
um, Darth Maul comics, Darth Maul
Mhm.
Shadowhunter, um, even some even just some minor even just some of the comics that came out before the Phantom Menace are
Mm,
Yeah.
referenced.
Well, some of the
And
early Republic issues.
yeah, some of the other
yeah.
Republic issues.
Mm.
There's also I think there's a couple of references. I think there's a reference to one of the Jedi Apprentice books, actually,
Yeah.
if I'm remembering
Mm,
correctly.
Well, even
Like that,
it's
there's
more
so
vague, but
much just
even
tied to that one book.
yeah, well, even Darth Bane, like even just the beginning of the
Mhm.
band, that
mm,
particular run of Sith,
Yeah,
that obviously is heavily referenced. So the references are very numerous in that particular
mhm.
book. Really, really
On
numerous.
topic, the Darth Bane trilogy is also a really good read if you're into
yeah,
dark side, wanting to know the mentality of the Sith,
Mm.
yeah.
and reading about
That
the
that would be a
origins
good
of
one to
the
start
whole of
from. And then there's also Tales of the Jedi as
Mhm.
well, which comes into if you're wanting just more Sith stuff, Tales of the Jedi is very good. You get Exar Kun, who
Yep.
revived the Sith at one point,
Mhm.
and then if you get some of the prequel stuff for that, you get Naga Sadow
Yeah.
mm.
and
And you
Ludo
also
Kresh.
get a good insight into the Jedi in that time period and everything
Yes.
going on there, which
Yeah. How
is
they're so different.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is cool.
Well, I've likened it so many times to our real world history, where if you study ancient Egypt, it has very little
Oh,
bearing on the people who populate Egypt today, but you
very
still learn
true.
so much. But you still learn so much about where humanity has come from, by and large, where our technology
Mm,
might have started. Certain religious things that have just echoed through time, as well as just the places are still there that they mention. All the towns that they mentioned, all the cities they mentioned, the countries that like the more things change, the more they stay the same. I guess is that old adage, but it's the same here in
True.
Star Wars, where you go back so far, none of the characters that you know and love are still alive. Most of the factions kind of they appear in a way, but they're like so
Yeah.
far distant from the factions you know.
mm,
But it's the same. They're still dealing with Coruscant being like the center of the Republic. You're still dealing with Jedi. Still dealing with Sith. You're still dealing with the idea of empires. So much of these,
mm,
and of course the alien races are all there. So
Right.
you're dealing with an awful lot of familiarity, despite the fact in some of these cases it's 1, 2, 4, 6,000 years prior. So
Yeah.
yeah.
or
And
15,000
And
years.
that's the thing.
thinking of Exar Kun, if you're not as interested in the overall how Heir to the Empire sounds, but you're more interested in honing in on how Luke rebuilds the Jedi Order, I do think Jedi
Hmm.
Academy trilogy is a great place to start as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Do not start with iJedi. You will be totally lost.
Well, I would almost
No, definitely.
want away from my Jedi until you've read more of the E. You'll know you actually really like a lot of it too.
You need to read the X-wing books before you read
Yeah.
iJedi.
And you'll
And
be
you
reading
shouldn't start.
Jedi Academy and then read that and go, hang on a minute.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
Yeah.
what's going on here? Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
the
It is
X.
actually a good idea to leave.
Mm,
I would say, because I've never done this in my life, and I've said this to Cal before,
mm.
because I've never done this in my life. I've never done a reading of Jedi Academy and then read iJedi straight after. There's always been a few years between
Yeah.
it for me. I'll read Jedi Academy, then I'll go back and play something, watch something,
I,
read something else.
I've been going
And
chronological, so it was straight afterwards.
Yeah.
yeah, and I can only imagine that would be more jarring. Like the more things you put in between the two, by the time you get back to iJedi, you're like, oh, this seems vaguely correct. It would only be if you've just read the Jedi Academy trilogy and then you've just gone straight into iJedi.
Oh,
Even the
yeah.
tiniest detail, you're gonna think, wait, what? So
Mm,
there is that.
yeah.
Yeah.
On the mention of the X-wing books, they're amazing.
Mm,
The Top Gun in space, so you don't get
Pretty
any of the
much.
Force
I
stuff
mean,
pretty well. Um,
I mean,
mhm.
yeah, it wouldn't
that's a
hurt to start there,
yeah.
honestly.
You
Mm.
get where the Republic's at, and then you also get one of the formative events of them leading up to the taking of Coruscant,
Yeah.
which is really
Mm.
good.
I mean, if you're wanting a story that's just kind of like you're dealing with a couple of characters from the original movies, and you're really not interested in Force stuff, because I do know people
Yeah.
who love Star Wars but have no interest in Jedi lore. Like the only drawback, of course, is Corran Horn, um, in the X-wing series, is that he is a descendant of a Jedi,
Mm.
and it eventually comes into him developing his Force talents, which
Mm,
again is not a bad thing if that's, but
No.
at the same time, like he's your main character for the majority
yeah.
of the Rogue Squadron focused books.
Mhm.
Then there's the Wraith Squadron books, which do get away from that
Yeah.
Yep.
a
Yeah.
bit more. They
Totally.
they don't really have much to do with the Force. I think Luke has an appearance in one of the books. I haven't gotten far enough
Yeah.
in them to
He
be
just
sure, but I
basically
heard.
has a cameo, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I
But it is
wasn't
one of
sure.
those things. It is quite amazing in the Star Wars universe. So, and I know, look, it's just because it is a work of fiction, but
Mm,
when you consider even at the very height of the Jedi Order, when they were just so exceedingly rare in the universe, the chance to come across a Jedi were probably nil. Many people have lived their entire lives on their planet, and a Jedi never even visited that particular planet. But the
mm,
That's
the, the
true.
galaxy's just that large, and the Jedi are so few. So the fact that so many of the books and comics just keep on coming back and leaning on someone with Force powers is it's almost amusing to me because like the
mm,
the chances
Yeah,
of spotting a Jedi would be so rare, so rare.
right.
mm,
Well, because if we were to look at the rough estimated number of Jedi in the galaxy at their height, which would
Mm,
be like a few, like 30 years before the Phantom Menace, as a rough number, as a rough
yeah.
time period. Um, they're looking at maybe like we're looking at still less than a million in a
Mm,
galaxy of trillions,
yeah.
mm,
trillions upon trillions of beings in this one galaxy, and there's only about around a million Jedi.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Numerically, the percentage
it's
would be so
very
ridiculously
tiny,
small, like zero
Mm,
point zero 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 0.00001 or something. Like it would be so small.
yeah.
right?
But yet somehow every single story involves a Jedi. It's like,
They
how does
can't
this keep happening?
they can't resist it. Something that doesn't
Yeah.
involve a Jedi at all. It involves some other
Mhm.
shenanigans, but not really with the
It's
Force.
it's actually very
As
hard.
if you want
It,
to follow one of the main big three characters, I'd
mhm.
probably say Han Solo is the strongest books out of them.
Yeah,
And that
Mm,
is with
yeah,
there's the main one I'd say is the AC Crispin Han Solo trilogy, I think
yeah.
is a bit stronger
yeah.
than the Brian Daly for finding
Mm,
out what happened in
That
a period of
yeah.
time, delves into his character a lot. But
Yeah.
but
then
again,
there's
like
also
Vegas.
another one where it allows space for the Brian Daly Han Solo adventures in between,
Mhm.
so you
Yeah.
could read those as
Oh, that's what
well.
I was going to say. Yeah, if you read them, again, I've never actually done it. I've never macheted them, but I imagine if you do read them in the way that they were designed, because the first two books in the Crispin, they're just novels unto themselves.
Mm.
Yeah, the third one brings in the daily ones, but there's actual slots, there's little interludes where those stories could drop in. And
Yeah.
I've never actually read them in order where I've just put down this novel, picked up that one and read it, and then I've never done that before, but for having
Right.
read them both at separate times, I can see how that would be really cool, like quite an
Yeah.
experience
Very
to
cool.
read through. So I want to do it at some point.
Oh yeah.
Because Rebel Dawn was a great book, so
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, they're all great, but doesn't miss, I don't think.
no.
Unlike some things like the Darthbane trilogy, you could tell some parts of it were rushed with the book 2 and 3.
Book
Mhm.
2 in particular
Yeah.
is like there's stuff where you're like, I feel like there's a lot to this book that wasn't actually written.
Mm.
Book
Um,
3
very
actually
cool.
feels like he had a little bit more time for, but he was still kind of rushed a little bit.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
I feel like he was told to make I feel like books 2 and 3 were meant to be like I feel like both of them got shortened for one reason or another, and like he
Mm.
was told to
Mm.
do this one job and he didn't, and then they kind of interrupted him to put him on something else, and
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
rush. Yeah,
It's that kind of
that
thing that's
does seem
unfortunate.
to
That
be an
happens with
issue.
some things, but when you've got so many authors and everything,
Yeah,
that
Mm.
I
happens.
mean, I will say this: the difference between books 2 and 3 and book 1 is that book 1 he had a comic series to build for. Drew Karpyshyn had a comic series to build off of.
Yeah.
Mhm.
As limited as it was, yeah, he did.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't very long. It was like what was it, like 5 issues? Something like that.
Oh,
It
look,
wasn't very
it's only 4 or 5. It couldn't, yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be 4 or 5.
Yeah,
Very,
it was
very
a
Yeah.
really
short.
short run, and like he had literally these handful of comics,
Mm.
and he had to build the story before and go a little bit beyond, and not
Oh,
even
And he
really.
also,
6
the short
issues.
story from Kevin J. Anderson, 6, oh, that could, the short story from Kevin J. Anderson also predated the novels as well, so he
Mm.
had that
Yeah,
to build on, but didn't utilize it very much, which is interesting.
I
But
mean he built on it a little. He kind of
yeah,
he kind of abridged it in one of his chapters.
yeah.
Mm.
Well, you still
That's
run
about
into the same issue that even though Kevin J. Anderson's short story was written first, the comics, which were arguably better known, already kind of made that semi-redundant. Like they already retconned
Mm.
just some of the parts there.
Yeah,
So, well, I mean, the main part was the idea that Bane had already left the planet without an apprentice. That was probably the biggest thing. But
yeah,
Yeah.
like I said before, there is no reason in my mind where, because of the way timelines work, that he couldn't have in the comic have left the planet, gone up, and then gone back to look for survivors or something like that. The whole interlude could have
right,
happened without necessarily breaking the continuity. But I mean, that's
Mm.
obviously a niche point for another time. But
right,
yeah, basically,
Yeah.
he had something to work on, as you say, for the first novel. There was existing
right.
material of some sort.
Mm.
Yeah.
No, and that's the thing. We just
Mhm.
had stuff to build for. Like they were still figuring
Mm,
out who Bane was and
yeah.
what the story was. And when they asked Drew to write the when Drew said he wanted to write the book, I believe
Mm,
that's the way it happened. When like he decided he was going to take what he liked out of the established stories that existed already, and then write the story that he wanted to tell.
mm,
You know, Xana was established in the comics at the end, and
yeah.
so he had to pull her. And then his plan for the Rule of Two was to kind of build up her character a little bit more, and I feel like he did that,
Mm,
but again, it feels abbreviated in some ways.
Mm.
yeah.
I will also mention very start of the timeline. I would recommend the Dawn of the Jedi comics. Those are quite good.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Possibly just not as a starting point for a new fan.
I'd probably
It
yeah,
depends.
unless if it's a new fan that already knows you're gonna commit to reading more.
right.
But
Or alternatively, if it's a new fan who's like, "Hey, I want to get into the EU and I really, really like rank calls. God, I wish they could fly." if you've got that particular fan,
Yeah.
Yes.
and that might be a very niche fan, but if that's where they start, then you're like, have
Yeah.
I got the comic? Wait, right here.
I've
So
literally had people say, start at the very beginning. And I'm like, why?
no,
Why
It is.
would you start
It is
there?
so much like. It's better to get an overall sense and then go if you really do feel like you're into it and you want to commit that
Yeah.
much to it, then go from the start.
Mm.
Yeah, I feel like it's more of a thing of let's table this is more of I feel like it's a good point to start if you're planning to do a chronological read.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't feel like it's a good point to start if you're brand new to the EU. Like if
Yeah,
you're
that's
just the movies, the last place that I would direct anybody who has not read a single comic or book outside of maybe the novelizations of the movies, like I would definitely not recommend Dawn of the Jedi. That's
No.
something
Yeah.
that I would say this is a great story, but it's not a good starting point unless you just want a story that takes place in the same universe.
Yeah, I feel like as we get further from the movies, the more different it feels. Like Legacy
Yeah.
would be
Mm.
another one where you probably wouldn't jump straight into it.
No.
Yeah, well, it'd be like if you had a fan of World War II and they're really into World War II kind of stuff, and that's their whole genre is 39 to 45. That's where they really focus.
Mhm.
He
Yeah.
said, you know what? I think you need to go back to the beginning. Here's a story about cavemen clapping rocks,
Yeah.
and you're gonna love this. It was like, like maybe if you're really heavily invested, you're gonna go back the whole way and just get the whole history of humankind, but probably not where you're gonna put someone if they're just that niche. They're like, hey, I've really enjoyed this little thing. You're like, well, go back that far.
Yeah.
Nah, maybe not.
No. I mean, I'm sure somebody would have loved to have start with Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void, and the and
Yeah,
Dawn of
that's
the Jedi comics.
not Into the Void is the novel for context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure there's somebody who thinks, man, I wish that I had started here and gone all the way through. And it's like, I'm sure there's a few people. I haven't met them, and
No.
I am not one of them.
I haven't met any of them. No.
I'm still
And-
going through chronologically from 2016 or whatever. That's more than 10 years now.
Oh
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chronological is quite a slog.
Yeah.
It's quite a slog.
Yeah.
I also
Yeah,
don't
and
want
you
to
have
rush
to
it
get
and then end up not really enjoying it. So that's good.
Right.
Because I've always wondered too, and I know this is probably a mild tangent. Sorry, tangent time.
Ah,
I've
lots
always
of
wondered
tangents.
if you were going to do a chronological reading. I almost wonder if you'd want to do a real world chronological reading, like actually start with what was published first. So not what's first in the timeline, but what was first published in the real world, and just watch the development of the galaxy, the development of ideas like the Force and the Jedi and its people, because there's a lot of development there.
Way to read.
I think that would be a
Yeah.
valid point to make for people that if
Because
they
you would start with
have started reading the EU and they go, "Oh, I know, I really love this. I want to read all of it." Once you've read enough to that point,
I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
There's also, and I'm not going to get the right word here at all, because it's more of a feeling than something you can actually grab onto. But I just feel like as the publication went on, Star Wars was taken a bit more seriously.
Yes.
A lot of the
Yeah.
early publications, particularly the Marvel ones again, but in general, more campy, more Flash Gordon-y, more Alien of the Week sort of things. Like the stories were, I don't want to say childlike, but certainly more basic, I guess, in terms of their themes and everything else. And then as the EU evolved, they started to take it more seriously. Where, to use a funny example, they wouldn't have had an entire arc about Darth Vader trying to tank the Alliance's credit score with the bank. They would have had something
Yeah.
else slightly more appropriate. And but yeah, as they went on, it was taken more seriously as the EU evolved. Probably after 1991 is when it started to take a bit more like a serious universe with real world tactics and real world ideas. The Force, of course, still being a massive thing. But
And there
yeah,
was still a
there's a
bit of
definite shift.
whimsy and oddities in the
Yeah.
world, but then it was balanced by a bit
Mm.
more in-universe realism, they'll call it. So, like, it
Yeah.
followed its own rules in the universe a bit more.
Right.
Mm. All I can say is just start reading whatever you can get.
Yeah,
Is
Mhm.
probably
that's
more the point
usually a
too.
good time, yeah.
Yeah, like, if you get into your library and your library just happens to have Truce of Akira, well, that's where you're starting. Like, just
Hey,
whatever it is you
Yeah.
can
it's
get
a
your
good
hands
starting
on.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
like,
mean,
just do it.
Mm.
I mean, for
Yeah.
me, like my initial start into like the books and stuff, my initial starting point was uh I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was either Jedi Prince
Mhm.
or Galaxy of Fear.
Yeah.
Mm.
And Galaxy of
Mhm.
Fear is pretty much Goosebumps in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
And it's one
that's
of the
all it
few
is.
examples of horror, which I guess is another. If you're a
Yeah,
horror fan, there are a couple of horror
Mm.
books, and the
yeah.
Galaxy of
There's
Fear
And then
series.
the other funny thing about them too is when you go and reread them, apart from the general childish tone of the overall thing, because again, it's a young reader's book. But apart from that, it doesn't necessarily break canon.
Mm.
The
no.
stories in there
I cared a
can
lot.
still. I mean, a few of the characters act a bit weird, and Thrawn is obviously one of them. That when you're reading Thrawn, you think this is definitely a scaled back Thrawn. This is more of a Thrawn without all of his nuance. It's a childish Thrawn, but
Mm.
Yeah.
again for a childish book, or a childlike book, and I
Yeah.
use that term with affection because I love that series.
Mm.
But
No,
apart from
it's
the fact that
definitely
some of
meant
the for a
it's
younger
meant for
audience,
someone younger to be reading it and
yeah.
understanding.
Yeah.
But in terms of the overall continuity, there's nothing there where you go, that couldn't happen in the Star Wars. It's like, no, that's
Right.
yeah, why not? Why not? Like a planet that eats people at this point, sure, let's go with that. The idea of an entire planet being one living sentient being is something that gets hit on rather hard later on in the EU. So why not? Yeah, sure,
Mm.
that's what's happening.
There's at least two more. So
Yeah. So there's nothing in those books, despite the fact that you might think they're a bit outlandish, being horror and goosebumpsy, and young readers
yeah.
like, no, canonically, they're right.
Mm,
They're
Yeah, they're
pretty
good.
much
no,
Like, while
they're
they
not
are
bad.
Goosebumps for Star Wars, there's more the style that they're written in than
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, they're just some separate story."
And it's
yeah.
it's
You
like
certainly wouldn't.
it's definitely not like there's not like a lot of like supernatural horror like you
Mm,
would sometimes get in Goosebumps. It's a lot more scientific actually.
And if you want to
yeah.
know about the guy that has a death sentence in 12 systems, he's in that.
Mm,
That's right.
it
Yeah, he
certainly
is in
is.
there. Yeah.
Mm,
But yeah, like that's the thing. You'll find like, start with whatever.
yeah.
Like if your kids are old enough to enjoy stuff like Galaxy of Fear or Jedi Prince are reasonable stories to start your children with.
Mm,
Though I
Yeah.
would personally recommend like going with Jedi Apprentice. I think that's a little bit more, and that's something that they can really grow
Mm.
up with.
yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
for sure.
especially like if they're like a couple of years younger than Obi-Wan because he's 12 in the first book, in the first like two books.
Mm,
If your kid's like 10 or 11, that's a great starting place because now you're
yeah.
feeling like you're growing up with Obi-Wan.
Mm.
Mm. And there's plenty of young reader books. All again, all through
Oh
the
yeah,
timeline.
Yeah.
So yeah.
yeah, you find them
So
throughout.
mm.
There's also
Well,
Jedi
some of the
Quest, which is growing up with Anakin.
And
there's
Tales
the
of
Star
the
Wars
Jedi,
journals.
they all
Oh yeah,
Jedi Apprentice, Jedi Quest, and
Yeah.
Tales of the Jedi all connect together with some of the same characters as well.
Because yeah, the
yeah,
journals are quite good in that they largely just tell the story of a particular movie from one character's perspective, but then
Mm.
they do add again a lot of different bits and pieces and scenes.
they
So
do.
yeah, there's a lot of young reader books out there. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I wonder before we mention the canon tiers if we should start slightly higher level with the Legends label, just get that out of the way, and then they can go, okay, that get rid of
Oh,
some of the new
get into
ones
that.
when people mention it, and then go into the canon tiers.
Okay, that's
Mhm.
fine. So the Legends label was essentially the Lucasfilm answer to what do we brand the expanded universe, because the expanded universe or extended universe has become
How dare you?
catch-all terms. So some people they've become catch-all terms for stories outside of
Hmm.
the main media.
Yeah.
So while I personally am bothered by that, the whole reason that expanded universe is referred to in such a way is because of the Star Wars expanded universe. If it wasn't for the Star Wars expanded universe,
Mm-hmm.
it would not be associated in this way.
Yeah.
People wouldn't think of it this way. So Lucasfilm, when they were bought by Disney, they wanted to get away from the established expanded universe and start their own thing, which in my head makes no sense because there's so much left to tell. There's gaps in every place. There are whole stories that because of this are unfinished. There was no reason to discontinue.
Yeah.
They wanted a blank slate, and they're even pulling stuff in, and they're doing it horribly.
Yeah, what they do, Burrow, they do worse.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of those
So-
things too that I mean, and again, this might to tangent quickly through Firefly, because Firefly's done the same thing.
Mm.
Where the comics and the novels currently end is 20 years on from the last movie, and the real world has also been 20 years. So at this point, if the actors were to come back now and I know they're doing an animated series, but if they were to come back and do like a live action set 20 years later, it would just tack onto the end. You don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can keep these novels. You can keep these comics because it's where they need to be. And the same thing had happened with the EU, where Legacy ends up is more or less within a number of years the same age where the actors were. And at the end of Legacy, Luke does mention, I might just nip off to a planet to sit on an island and chill out for a while by myself. So the players are almost in the same spot where the sequel trilogy started, again in very vague terms. So there was almost no need to, because if they said, we couldn't have the sequels set, because you had so many novels in the way, it's like, no, we didn't. The actors are the same age as the end of Legacy, and then there's this big gap until the beginning of the Legacy comics where you can set whatever movies you want. But they chose to just throw it out, which was bizarre.
And there was no reason for it.
I do believe that their reason is more because they wanted their own vision when Kathleen Kennedy took over Lucasfilm compared to what George was doing with it.
Right. And so that's essentially where Legends gets titled the way that it does.
So they
Legends covers everything.
Some of the expanded universe books with this Legend banner on it. So if you haven't looked in any bookshops for the books since ever, because you're a new fan, they have some of the books. It's still in some places I've seen without banners, but most of the reprints have this Legends banner on it, and some have completely different covers, but they still have Legends in it.
I have noticed they have not done any reprints for the New Jedi Order. So the New Jedi Order won't have the Legends label.
And there's very few reprints for any young readers novels.
Yeah. Very few.
I think Rebel Force, I noticed, got a reprint somewhere. That's the only one I've seen.
Which was really random, by the way. But no, it did.
That's a very random one. Like,
yeah.
I forgot that one existed until you brought it
like
up.
Exactly. If you were to rank your favorite young reader thing, I don't know how far down they would have been, but no, I have actually seen them
pretty low.
Yeah. Which
like
again isn't to say they're bad stories. It's just that they're somewhat more obscure. And so I was like, is that really where you're going to start?
You would think that they would want to reprint Jedi Apprentice and Jedi Quest. You would think that if they were going to, those ones would be ones, because it's Obi-Wan as an apprentice, it's Anakin's apprenticeship before Attack of the Clones. Like, these are stories that you would want people to read.
But they don't want people to read them. Haha.
The there's also young reader novels that I wish they'd reprint only because they're nigh impossible to get.
Yeah.
Now, I've
Oh,
got them, but the only
no
reason I've
kidding.
the only reason I've got them is because 'cause I'm as old as the hills, and I was there.
The
But
hills are
a
12
lot of
years
people
old. There
weren't.
you go.
The hills are 12 years old. There we go. But, but no, like the adventures, so the Star Wars Adventures series, which you
Mhm.
used to get in the mail every fortnight or whatever it was. Like I've got the full
Yeah.
set up the back there somewhere, and they're also really fun reads. And the continuity in them again in terms of
Mhm.
canon, it fits. It's fine.
I
Oh yeah.
believe the episode
I think
1 adventures also out of interest for anyone. You can probably find the ebooks if it's easier.
mm,
Yeah.
Is the only account of how Jar Jar got exiled.
yeah,
That is true.
and
That is true.
and I
That
think
is
it's
in there.
a fourth book or something, but the one that's centered around Darth Maul.
Mm.
Again, gets referenced throughout the further EU later on. So it canonically they're great little reads.
Mm.
But if you weren't there
Yeah.
at the time to buy them, because I don't think they ever got offered just on a shelf. I don't think you'd ever walk into a bookshop and go, "Ooh," and pick it up.
Mm.
They and the fact that they'd never been reprinted again is a little bit harsh, I would have thought. But
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah.
Here
And
we
if
are.
they reprinted a bunch as omnibuses, that would be really good. So part of why we
Nice.
don't tend to use the Legends label that they slap on it.
Bro, the
Yeah.
basic one for me is that I was never a Legends fan.
Mm.
In 1991, I wasn't a Legends fan. I was a Star Wars fan. In
Yeah.
'94, I was a Star Wars. I wasn't. I was a Star Wars fan,
Mm.
and
In
that's the way I went that entire
2005, I
ride.
was a Star Wars fan.
There you
That
go.
is all I was.
And Legends didn't come into it, and so to suddenly relabel it later is a little bit bizarre. It'd be,
Hmm.
I mean, I don't really. There's not a lot of real world things I can bring. Well, okay, Lord of the Rings. If you were a Lord of the Rings fan,
Mm.
and I went and I bought the entire franchise, I said we're now just going to call this Bob's Adventures in Mordor, and you're like, wait, what? And it's like, yeah, you're a Bob's fan. You're a
Yeah.
Bob's fan. It's like, I don't. Who is this Bob? What's going on? Like, you can't just take what you grew up with, what you were a fan of, and then I want to just change it willy nilly and expect you to run
Mm.
along with this. I'm like, well,
Right.
no, I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm an EU fan. I don't know what you're on about. What's this Legends nonsense? It's
Yeah.
for me. It's like, yeah, none of my books say Legends on them, so I'm like, well, why?
Mm.
Right.
What
Oh,
are you
what?
talking about? It's very weird.
Marvel 108 will be the only one.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And but the other thing I was actually going to say too, with the Legends now, I'm going to have to rely on one of you two because, of course, I haven't followed what's been going on since 2014. But there were two omnibuses which I think collected short stories from the Insider magazine,
Yes.
and they
Yes.
were labeled Legends, but they actually have Disney canon stories in them as
Yeah, they
well.
had
So
about a 50-50 split, but they plastered the Legends label
mm,
on the front and it made no sense.
yeah,
That was
so
just to increase the sales.
And they could have
mm,
put include stories from Legends. I think I talked about it in a video one time about when it
Yeah.
was
I
announced.
think that
mm,
would have been more honest if they had done it that way.
yeah,
But
Yeah.
I never got them. I just remember hearing about them.
Yeah, I still have never
no,
bought them.
same, no,
No,
Um,
I mean, and I got to be honest. Had they decided to continue the EU under the Legends banner, it wouldn't bother me quite so much.
yeah,
yeah.
that's fair. That is fair.
But they didn't.
Mm,
Mm.
Like aside from Star Wars 108, there's nothing.
yeah.
Yeah. And Star Wars 108 too. I think again, it's one of those things that we
Mhm.
reluctantly say is, was it almost a blessing that they cut off the EU when it did? Because yeah, we didn't get ends to so many of these stories, but when you look at the kind of quality threshold that they've had ever since, you think it's probably for the best.
It is
With the way some things
arguably.
have been treated, yeah. You look at SWTOR and
Yeah, it's
Marvel
like,
108 and go,
yeah, maybe it's better we don't actually touch that because.
Yeah.
Because again, like if they were to say right now that we are going to continue the old EU timeline and the first novel we're going to put out is Sword of the Jedi, while I think
Mhm.
we'd all be initially quite excited, to be a rather reluctant excitement. Where it's like,
I think,
well,
yeah, it'd be a tempered excitement.
Yeah.
yeah, because well, what are you
Because we're
guys actually
gonna. The
doing?
first question we would ask is, how much is going to change from what was originally planned?
It's even like
Yeah,
they announced the KOTOR remake. They say they're doing it. The initial question is
mm,
like, what are you going to change in it? And is that going to stay
Right.
faithful to the EU?
Mhm. Or even faithful to itself.
Yeah. So, my
Okay.
listing, some of the reasons I have are similar. Let's see what
Mhm.
else I want to say then. Expanded Universe was official branding from Lucasfilm as well back in the day, whereas the new canon
Yeah.
has never been branded Expanded Universe
No,
in
it's
their
just been branded
marketing.
Star Wars stuff. It's just
Yeah,
Star Wars
Which
books, Star Wars comics,
yeah.
Star Wars
Which
TV
in
shows.
fairness, and I don't usually give the new owners fairness, but in fairness, at the time, they very likely didn't know that was gonna be the case because the term
Right.
expanded
Mhm.
universe was just such a large part of the zeitgeist. It was already in everyone's minds as
Yeah.
this is what we refer to it as. They probably didn't realize that if they brought out what were some of the first books? They brought out that absolute Chuck Wendig, that absolute lovely chap.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, I'm not gonna
yeah,
even say.
no, when he first brought out those, because I remember them being some of the very first novels, they probably didn't know if the public would just simply refer to these as expanded universe novels
Yeah.
out of just me
Mhm.
brain, their own memories. Just go, "Oh, expanded universe books. Look at this expanded universe book."
Yeah,
So
and
the
I've
fact that that
seen
term
people
was
do
so
that
widely used.
online of, like, they call it
Yeah.
new EU rather than the old EU.
Mm.
Yeah,
And so
there
not
are people who do
knowing
look at it that way.
yeah. So
Mm.
not knowing what the public was gonna do at the time is probably another reason why they would have thought, "You know what? Just in case they
Right,
keep referring to this as EU, it's gonna get complicated real fast." So that's
right,
Legends.
Yeah.
But
right. But
that
I like
could be.
outside of like the diehards who really read this,
Mhm.
Mm,
I don't know anybody
Yeah, most
who
of the time
actually
I've
like
just seen
most of
it
the time it's
online.
online people who
Yeah.
have read both and
yeah.
like both. It's usually those people who refer to the new stuff as expanded universe.
Yeah.
Most people who have never read the expanded universe, they and have only read the new Star Wars stuff, they're just like, oh, the Star Wars books and comics.
Oh,
That's all
yeah.
they ever refer to them as.
And it's
Mm.
interesting because I was thinking of the
'Cause-
other part of people that don't even know there's so many books and comics. Like, they just
Mhm.
know there's
I've had
movies.
that. I've met
Oh
them.
man.
I've met them. I've definitely met them. My
Mm.
favorite run-in with those as an absolute miniature side tangent was I had a flatmate about 15 years ago, and she brought her boyfriend over. He's a lovely, lovely guy. I think they're still together. And he came into the house and he just saw one shelf of my Star Wars books. He went, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize this is like 12 books or whatever."
Mm.
And almost like a comedic movie, he looked at this one shelf and went, "I didn't realize there were so many Star Wars books." And then he looked down and went, "Wait, these are what?" And he looked at the shelf next to it, and then he looks at the wall and his mouth escapes. How are there so many Star Wars books? What the? He didn't realize it was the entire wall. I'm like, yep. And he actually made his girlfriend get a photo of him in front of it just with his thumbs up, like getting because he'd
Nice.
never seen it in his life. He was just that
Man, that's
mesmerized.
hilarious.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
yeah, people genuinely don't know.
I've shared pictures of my collection when I'm out, and people are just so amazed. Like, my
Oh
parents
yeah,
didn't know there were so many Star Wars books before I started collecting them more.
Mm,
I believe it.
yep. Oh, no, it
I
is it
believe
is
it.
Um,
it is quite
oh,
mesmerizing.
I'll
Yeah.
leave
I mean,
one
my mom had no idea until I started asking for Star
Mm.
Wars books and stuff. Like she knew about comics, but she didn't realize how many books there were until we
More how
started
many
looking for them.
comics? There's been
Oh
many
yeah.
many there's many EU fans I
Oh,
know
yeah.
that have been fan listen to poor Cal sigh. There's been
I
so many
was
fans I
looking,
know
I
that have
saw a
been
post recently, it said there was something like 760 comic issues, but I haven't verified that number.
yeah, but that's the thing because even people who are EU fans have been for a while when they think to
It
themselves, "You
sounds
know
about
what?"
right.
Mm.
Yeah, and they think, "I'm gonna complete my collection. I'm actually gonna go on eBay and I'm gonna look up the stuff I don't have and I'm gonna complete my collection." And then they look at their cart, $10,000 later and
Oh
go,
man.
Yeah.
because it's so much more than you think, and it didn't seem a lot to me because luckily, again, I
Mm.
was one of that older generation that could
Yeah, and it
buy
was
things as they
spread
came
over
out.
time, yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
I'd go down to the
it does make a
newsagents.
difference.
Yeah, well,
Mm.
it was huge for me because I'd go down to the newsagents as a kid, and I don't know where your comics came from, but we had a news agency near me that did it,
Mm.
and the comics were I don't know $2-3 or whatever, and that was
Yeah.
for the week.
That
maybe for a fortnight.
$10,000 back then were probably like $5,000
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
as
for me
well.
it was the comic book store. That's what we
Mhm.
do here.
Mm.
Just comic book stores.
Mm.
Yeah, well, I mean, I still do it now, and again, not to go back to Firefly, but I was buying all the Firefly comics, and at the
Oh, yeah.
time when they're only coming out once every couple of weeks, it didn't seem that bad. It's like, oh, it's only $15, but there
Right.
is no way I would have bought it as one lump sum. If someone said, "Here's
Mhm.
all the comics, it's going to cost you about $1,000," you go, "Oh, I don't have 1,000 on me right now. What?"
Yeah.
Like
I
it's
think my parents found a stack of Star Wars comics for like $50. I'm like, yeah, great.
Oh yeah,
I
that's
Take
worth
that.
it.
yeah,
If
Yeah,
I
we
actually
move on
found
a
stuff
you
little
on
get
bit
eBay.
really
more as
lucky when you
well.
go to like garage sales and find like these old
Mhm.
comics. It's great.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You can find that stuff.
I'll quickly blast my last couple of reasons out because I'm looking at the time as well.
Yeah.
That's fair. Yep.
After what Lucasfilm's done to the expanded universe with the lack of transition, then the
Mm.
label of Legends gives the impression of it being less than what new canon is, and that's another reason why I
Yeah.
don't like it.
Yep.
Yeah.
In the introduction to some of the newer reprints called the Essential Legends collections, especially in the unabridged audiobooks and in the physical copies I got someone to send a picture of, it explicitly states
Mhm.
that the expanded universe is now labeled Legends, but they've framed it in a way that it is not a noun that is referred to the new canon,
Mhm.
Yep.
which is interesting detail. And then what would segue to other things is they have reprinted material that is Infinities, as we talked about earlier, not canon,
Mm.
with the Legends banner on it, which causes
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
confusion as to what counts towards continuity and doesn't.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And those
So
are
the
the
only thing
main
there,
things
though,
there.
I mean, as I think I've said before, though, with Infinities, we are largely blessed with the idea that because say Star Wars Tales, those comics,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and I will die on this hill. Some of them were canonical, some of them aren't, and
So,
by
yeah,
and large,
from issue 21, they started printing canonical ones.
well, yeah, from issue 21, they're fully canonical, but prior to that, they still considered at least half of them. But
Yeah,
again, that's
Mhm.
definitely a different
that's
video.
probably a different.
But yeah, but the thing is, end of the day, though, luckily, if you were reading them, it doesn't really take too many brain cells to get
No.
2 panels into a comic and go, "Oh, this is not part of the overall
Yeah.
continuity," which is something else I was going to bring up when we do get to the canon tiers. Is the way I read Star Wars prior to those ever coming out was important. Which I don't know when we are getting to the canon tiers, but I've got observations there. So with the canon tiers, I mean, it's 2 things. It's a big thing, and it's also something you shouldn't even worry yourself about.
Yeah.
So the
Oh.
canon tier system basically was announced at one point, much later on in the whole release date of the EU, to try and clear up some of the inconsistencies that people were questioning with the 2008 Clone Wars show.
Yeah.
That ended up revealing an internal documentation system that was used to notate where particular information came from to see how much the public would be aware of it, especially, but also how much they would pull from it and that kind of thing. So, the canons that were mentioned were G canon, which is all the stuff that came from George Lucas himself, which, as mentioned earlier,
Yep.
he could change his mind as well.
Hmm.
T canon, which
And
was
he
like
often
pretty
did.
much just for the 2008 Clone Wars
Filoni.
because they changed
Yeah.
the just for him. C canon was the
Mhm.
main continuity canon. S canon was secondary canon. And then you had non-canon for Infinities stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, for
The
me
basic
growing
rundown
up
of it.
prior to that, because prior to that, because obviously I was a Star Wars fan well before that ever dropped as an idea. And it didn't phase me. I didn't there's not the lens that I read things through. I didn't read Out of the
Mhm,
Empire and go, "Oh, this is more important than that comic," or Dark Empire, for instance. I
mhm.
Right.
didn't read it and say, "Oh, this is a novelization, therefore what happens in here is more important than what happens in Dark Empire," just being a comic which is not as important as what happened here because that's a short story. Like there was no way I was thinking within that
No.
frame. It was just this is all Star Wars, and it was all Star Wars.
Yeah.
The movies, the comics, the novels, the games, it all just blended into this is Star Wars. It's one continuity, it's one timeline, and that's what they were setting out to give the audience. So just because we get to look behind the curtain and go, oh, there's actually some canon tiers back here, was probably the wrong approach. I know why they released it, but I feel like it was a wrong approach because it just started this rather bizarre discussion of, oh, well, this should be here, that should be there, that should be there. Whereas prior to that, it was, this is Star Wars.
Yeah.
And it was much, much nicer growing up as a fan when this was Star Wars.
I remember when I first found out about the tiers, and of course this was after TCW had been released, and I was on an online role play thing, and I was making a reference to something, and I think we were just in a chat, not in the actual role play stuff, and I mentioned something, and I think it was about Ahsoka, and I was like, because it was specifically, because this is where I understood, this is where it became a thing for me, and I had said, well, this is a thing, this is what Ahsoka, like this is this, and it had something to do with Ahsoka, and they're like, well, yeah, but that's T canon, and I'm like, I have no idea what you mean by that, and then they laid out the 5 tiers of canon for me, and I was like, oh, okay. So then I look it up, and I'm like, oh, this is a genuine thing. And I was very confused by it. I was like, so anything George said, and the way that it was explained to me at the time, and the way that it seemed from what I found from the article I found, it seemed that, okay, what George says is always canon. What comes out,
which is also not true,
right? But that's the way it was explained to me, and that's it. So what? And then what comes out on TV is more canon than anything after it,
but not the micro series.
Right. Right. Anything from TCW on, like, which of course nothing ever came out after TCW because they discontinued. They stopped, like they had like 3 things planned that never
rest in peace
came out.
Rest in peace Detours.
Yeah. Rest in peace Underworld.
Rest in peace Detours.
Well, Detours was never meant to be canon anyway. But
no, but being TV would have fallen into T anyhow and just really thrown a spanner right in those works.
Oh, probably,
It was. I think it was meant to be its own thing. I think they had a D canon that was supposed to be D.
Oh yeah. They were gonna have D.
And then they had C canon, which was any books published that were following the continuity of the stuff in G and T canon, and then S canon, stuff that came out before they established the C canon, and then N canon was infinities and anything considered not canon.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And I had this belief for like 10 years, and then someone finally pointed out that's not what that actually is. They're just laid out so that the internal continuity so that the writers dealing with this internal continuity can keep track of things. And I'm like, really? Then why did they bother showing this to us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because TCW came out and everyone was asking questions. I think that was the main reason.
Because they never would have had to prior to that. They never had to.
Yeah.
Because everything.
Well,
everything
and even then, they didn't have to. They could have just said, like the new stuff. They could have just said new stuff overrides a previous stuff. They could have just said, they could have just said that, because no one had a problem. No one had a problem when George changed things from it with the prequels.
Well, some people had problems.
Well, yes, but the majority were like, it's George Lucas's story. He can do that.
Yeah.
When TCW came out, people were like bothered, but not as much as I think the people at Lucasfilm were thinking they were. Yeah, people were bothered.
Mm.
No denying that, but I don't think it's as much as the Lucasfilm people thought.
Yeah, and
And
online exaggerates
I
things
think
a lot too.
right, and I think that by allowing the public to see the canon tiers, it allowed a lot of misinformation about the canon tiers to come out.
Yeah. And
Because
people, I
Well,
think even the name made it become misconstrued because canon tiers,
mm,
okay, just from the name you go, okay, things must be having some
right, you
hierarchy.
you think of a hierarchy when you think of tiering.
yeah,
So when you put G canon at the top and N canon at the bottom, especially because G canon is the word of George Lucas, so the
Mhm.
movies and anything he says, and N canon is anything expressly not canon.
yeah.
These other three kind of seem to be on a level of what's more canon than than the thing above than the thing below it. Like
Mm.
that's what it appears to be.
It's
You
also funny
know.
too that one of the metrics that you use is how bothered fans are. Because I don't think
Mm-hmm.
fans are any more bothered than they are right now. So if you were trying to bring out
No.
these canon
Definitely not
tiers
more
as
bothered
a
than
way to
now.
stop no, because for some reason,
No.
because prior to that, and again, I can only go off my own lived experience, but prior to that, being a Star Wars fan was actually pretty chill. Particularly around '99 when obviously Episode One
Right.
dropped. It was a big thing we'd talk about at school, and all the kids would be chatting back and forth about it. And you just have kids saying, "Oh yeah, no, I really like because there's this one book where Han and Leia actually have some twins." And everyone's like, "Oh wow," the ones that haven't read it, like, "Oh." No one was saying anything against it because like, well, that's just what happened. That was in the books.
Right.
It was
Mm.
all Star Wars, so no one was bothered. Then, well, I say I'm sure somebody was, but in general, it was a very chill fandom. Everyone was happy to discuss everything that was going on, and no one was like,
Mm.
"Oh, you're a
Right.
comic fan, ew." Just it was all fine, certainly in my experience. And then TCW obviously drops, and there's a little bit of bother. So to try and fix
Right.
it, they bring out these canon tiers. Now there's some significant bother because what do you mean the comics are all the way down here? And then obviously
Yeah.
they decanonize things and make this legends and make this that, and now the bother is through the roof. So if you were trying
Right.
to not bother the fans, the exact opposite has happened.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was getting at. Like there was no
Yeah,
reason to tell us
no,
this. It
Yeah.
like people are like, but I think also at the same time you have to remember like the when the Phantom Menace came out, internet chat rooms and public internet was still relatively new.
Mm.
Like
yeah,
people interacting with each other online.
hmm.
Yeah.
Which is
Like
also
direct.
always been an uglier thing
Yeah.
Yeah,
because
That's the
yeah.
thing, it's
I've seen
always
people talk to each other
exaggerating.
online. Oh
And
my lord, yes.
but like the next two movies like weren't terribly big. Like we had like social media was still developing
Mm,
when fe- when Revenge of the Sith came out. By the
yeah.
time the TCW movie came out, Facebook was in full force.
Hmm.
MySpace was on decline, but Twitter was on the rise.
Yeah.
And so people were really expressing themselves
Mm,
online, especially on Twitter,
Mhm.
because it was literally designed to just for people to just say whatever they were thinking and you know open a chat basically.
yeah.
So it was very public.
Mm.
So yes, there were a lot of negative opinions
Hmm.
coming out, but there were no more negative opinions coming out than there were beforehand. It was just
Mm,
more public. That's all it
Yeah.
was.
And they got a loud
And I think they didn't
platform.
realize that what they were doing, which was attempting to do damage control, was actually causing more
it's doing
damage.
Mm.
damage. Yep.
Yeah, and
You
we could
know,
go this
Yep.
whole thing and not mention the canon tiers, but unfortunately, when you start looking at some of the EU and start looking up some things, you go, "Oh, what's this?" And then you start getting led to misinformation. So
mhm.
it's worth
Well,
mentioning.
and like one thing I will say though is that in a way there is there is a little bit of a sense of TCW is more canon than things in C canon, and C canon has a little bit more canonicity than S canon.
Yeah.
In a sense. Because if you think about it, like C canon, it has no problem overriding S canon stuff. There's plenty of things in S canon that have been completely overridden.
Yeah. Which, for
just by
context,
C canon.
we mentioned the classic Marvel comics earlier. That would be
Mm.
classic Marvel comics that were put in S canon because they were a lot earlier
Yeah.
released before they were focusing on the continuity more.
Yeah.
But the thing is, though, is also as a quick sentence, the one thing you've probably noticed, Cal, is despite that, when you go through and you read the old Marvel comics, 80% of it is still absolutely fine.
Yeah.
In C canon,
And then
like
there's this whole
there's not a
thing
lot.
where, if C canon mentions it and references it, then that makes it higher tier, whatever.
Oh, which that's manic.
Part of the actual thing.
Yeah, that's
How
definitely
Leland
manic.
Chi was trying to do.
I
I've
straight
heard
up
that said
argued with
before.
people about this because it was like, that's not how that works, guys. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leland
all
Chi
that
mentioned it
did
in some ways,
was
but
just acknowledge it.
so much of
Yeah.
that, if that was happening, was not that particular comic. It was, that's, take Lumia, for example, Lumia. That's the Shira Breed character
Yeah.
coming into C canon.
Right. That's all it is. It's just it's just the character.
So not
and a
even
little bit
referencing
of-
X material. It was, this ship,
Right.
this character.
Well,
Whatever.
it doesn't bring the whole work with it. Like one that I saw recently, which I thought, well, obviously you're off your rocker, was someone they brought Dash Rendar into the Disney. I don't know how they've done it. I don't know to what degree. Someone said, oh, that must mean now that everything that he was in was now canonical. So now we've got Shadow's Empire, or whatever. It's all canonical now. I was like, that's not how that's not how it's gonna work.
No.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
No, that's like because they've acknowledged they've made Corran Horn as well. Like so,
And they
the X-wing
in one of
novels
the
are now
art
all canon.
books,
No,
in one of the
they're
art
not.
books, they mention
That's not how that
Exar Kun and
works.
have a reference to Exar Kun, so now he must be canon.
Right.
Well, I mean, to use the most
reference
obvious example,
like
to use the most obvious example, Luke Skywalker, I'm pretty sure he appears in the EU once or twice. But the fact that Luke
Yeah.
Skywalker is mentioned in the very first of the Disney movies, I assume, doesn't mean that suddenly he just brought the whole EU with him because he's mentioned. It's
No.
like, well, this is obviously a separate character. That's not how the mentioning of one character in a work doesn't bring the whole work with
Right.
them. And
No.
which is, I've seen that
Or
many
even
times.
that character appearing.
Right.
Madness.
Right.
Yeah, very,
Well,
very,
and that's
very bizarre.
one of the things that a lot of people who want to bring EU characters like Mara Jade into Disney canon don't seem to understand. They're not bringing that character in. They're not bringing in the character They're bringing in a character with that name and with
name only.
and maybe a similar backstory, but it won't be the same backstory.
And you could argue with say Thrawn, because again I'm very unfamiliar with the new canon material, but from what I understand, Thrawn is largely a similar character.
As he was brought in by Timothy Zahn, he opened up the first book
with the EU backstory.
With the EU backstory. So he has the original backstory, at least as far as it goes. And I think Timothy Zahn was I think he was trying to kind of bridge the EU and Legends with those novels.
Yeah.
I believe he was. So, but am I reading those books? Am I going to them and thinking of them as EU? No.
No.
Why? Because I have no desire to.
I'm going to read out a post on the old Sales.com forums from Leland Chi from October 25th, 2005. Here's how I use it. We need a list of characters from the films. I'll do a search of characters by G-Canon. We need a list of some planets from the films in the EU. I'll do a search for planets sorted by canon to determine which ones are going to be recognized by more people. source A contradicts source B, more likely than not,
Mhm.
if source A is from the films and source B is from the EU, we'll use source A. Of course, there can always be exceptions, which is why the case-by-case determination is always in effect, no matter what the source is.
Yep.
That's
That's
just
how it
how
works.
it works.
And like I said, prior to that list coming out, you just read it all as one big Star Wars. That's all it was.
Right.
There was no, you
Right,
didn't bother with this
so-
kind of
And
stuff.
that's all it is.
It-
It's like, of course, Boba Fett being Jassim real is not correct because in the movies, he's the clone.
But like a lot of things, works that were written afterwards managed to bring those two together. Managed to make it make
Yeah.
sense in some abstract fashion, such as what was the other one? Skywalker's one that's SKYE Skywalker's. That particular one, which also managed to retcon one of the comics where it made sense because they were just like in the original story, they told Luke, "Oh yeah, your father came here and that he was with a guy called Darth Vader," sort of thing. And like, doesn't make sense in a popular setting. But of course, they just did the quick concordance of fealty. They've just swapped their lightsaber hilts. That's why they assumed that the guy carrying Anakin's lightsaber hilt was Luke's father. It's like, no, that wasn't actually Luke's father. Luke's father was the same person as Darth Vader. Just those kind of
some
things where they
stuff
could go
like
back
that.
and retcon it. Yeah, and they could retcon it in a way that would make sense. And so you can actually read the old Marvel comic in its entirety. And even with what at first appears to be a contradiction, you read later on in somewhere else in a short story where they fix it and go, oh yeah, actually this just completely fits. That's fine.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's good.
So
Yeah, it's a
it was-
continuity error versus a continuity mistake
Right.
because you can
It's
correct an
very
error.
easy to adjust those.
yeah, it's just
Like-
missing a bit of context.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Missing
yeah, and the same would
context
go.
is much easier to work with.
Well, it'd be the same for the movies. If you watched episode 1 and Anakin is a nice little child, and then you go straight to A New Hope, and you're like, wait a second, did they just say Anakin's this big evil bloke? And they're no, that's obviously an error because you're missing quite a bit of context where he turned to the dark side and blah blah blah. So without the context, some things can seem quite out of place, but you get the context for it and go, oh, this is all fine. This is perfectly canonical.
And
No
some
worries.
people are fine without the context, but I think that, especially
Mm.
with the movies, there's even things in the movies where having the context from the EU makes it so much better.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
part
yeah.
of the draw for me as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
Context and going, oh, I understand that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I think those are the main points I wanted to cover. If you guys
Yeah.
have any other
Mhm.
thoughts on things worth mentioning, then go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think we just said it. I mean, to summarize it all.
Yeah.
Start the EU where you can. There's obviously some better places than others. Truce of Bakura is much better place to start than the second book of the Black Fleet Crisis, for example. But you'd probably enjoy both if you were to read them for the first time. It's not a huge issue.
Yeah.
And probably don't really even think about the canon tiers while you're reading because
Yeah, don't.
we
Don't do
we
that.
weren't at the
Just
time.
don't. It's
We
just
weren't at the
Star
time.
Wars and then Infinities. That's all you have to worry about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the infinities by and large are really obvious when they're happening. You
Oh,
don't
yeah.
need to have someone hold your hand and go, "Oh, this isn't part of continuity." So I can tell.
Yeah.
I can tell this isn't part of
Yeah,
continuity.
if you think that Skippy the Jedi droid is canon, you did not read it.
Yeah.
You did not read the story.
Wait, what do you mean he's not? What do you mean?
Just
he's not a
because
Jedi?
it was printed
My
in
childhood's
officially
been
licensed
ruined.
material, of course, is canon.
My childhood's been ruined.
Yeah, for
Oh,
sure.
good old Skippy.
And
Yeah.
read it for the fun of it, and you can pick where you like.
Yeah.
If you have
Mm.
any other questions, there's putting comments. I don't know if there's comments on Apple Podcasts, but there's comments on Spotify. And
there's
is
comments on
YouTube where
Spotify and on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where you'd be able to ask. I have a Discord server. You could drop in there and chat if
Yep.
you wanted to. Other than that,
Yeah, and
that's
they are.
pretty much
There
it.
is a link, I think, in every podcast availability. We
I
should
know
check Apple.
I know I
Yeah.
put links on YouTube, especially
Hmm.
because it's easier to put in the
Nice.
description. I don't
Yeah,
think links
there's a link to
work
the
in
website.
Spotify
There's a link to
descriptions. But yeah.
Discord.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of other things on there, but those are the two things that are
Yeah.
the most important.
And yeah, it has been good. If there's anything else that's big enough that's worth talking about from some of the questions, maybe we could do an episode discussing some of the questions, whatnot. That'd be
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
Huge thanks for hanging out at the brightest center in the galaxy. If you want to hear more, make sure to follow on the platform of your preference. I'm your host, Callum, and this has been the Callum's Cantina podcast. And remember, the films are just the beginning. The expanded universe is where the galaxy truly grows into its own. So see you next time you visit the Cantina.